Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another one of our Transparency Consent Framework webinars. This week we have quite a short agenda, but hopefully interesting regardless of that. We'll be talking about the mobile in-app specifications, which recently underwent an update after a public consultation phase. To present about these specifications, we have Jawad Stouli from Didomi, who's joining us, who's been working on updating the specifications and will give us an overview of the specifications and the kind of specific mobile challenges that CMPs face. And after that, you have an opportunity to ask any questions of Jawad and of myself as well about the framework in general, or more specifically about the mobile implementation. And once we're through the questions, we'll give you back the rest of the hour, assuming we don't take the whole hour. So without any further ado, Jawad, I would ask you to go ahead and present your stuff.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. So my name is Jawad Stouli. I'm the CTO of Didomi, a company that builds a content management platform. We've been very involved with the IAB Tech Lab specifically, and on the mobile spec this last few months. So I volunteered for giving an intro to the spec and why it was important to get it out the door. I'm going to be running through the framework, the specificities of the mobile spec, but feel free to ask any question you might have as I go. All right, so as a general thing, and that's not necessarily specific to the mobile version, but the IAB Transparency and Consent Framework is focused on giving a standardized ways of sharing consent with vendors and SDKs, and in this case, specifically mobile apps. But really, the general idea is we want to be in a situation where, as a publisher, you can collect consent exactly once, make sure that you have all the right vendors, all the right purposes, all the right privacy disclosures in that consent information, and then share that consent easily with any vendor you might be working with. And that was the original idea that got everyone started working on the framework. And that's kind of both a very important one for actually being able to implement any correct and simple consent collection workflow, and also a pretty important way of making it really doable for publishers, where otherwise it's a lot of one-to-one integrations with your vendors. It's a lot of work versus hopefully with the framework, it's way more streamlined. The web version has been out for at least 2 or 3 months now. I think we've, as you know, personally as a company, we've deployed a fair amount of publishers, and I know all the other content management platforms out there, and a lot of publishers themselves have been building towards that web spec with a lot of success so far. So we're definitely looking forward to working on the same things for the mobile version. So, you know, in your application, if you're a publisher or if you're a CMP, really what you end up doing is showing a consent collection screen in the same way as you would in a web version. What this actually looks like is not part of the spec. So you're entirely free to either use like a standard screen provided by your CMP, or that you build yourself, but you can also make something that's way more integrated with your application. If it's like a game or something, you might want to have something that basically, you know, from a UI perspective is closer to the rest of your application. So this part is not really in the spec. What's in the spec is more about the exact disclosures, so the exact purposes you're showing to the user, the type of content you're really collecting, but then what it actually looks like is up to you, which, you know, we think is important to make sure we can be adopted by as many publishers as possible. And to some extent, one key question that you might ask before we dive into the mobile standard is, what do we actually need a standard there? So I touched upon the first 2 points here. The first one was improved user experience, so making sure you can have only one consent collection screen versus having all your SDKs or all your vendors collecting different consents at different times. The idea is to have an easy way to collapse all those content collection into one. And be able to do that exactly once. So we've all been getting thousands of emails in the last few months, and we kind of like want to avoid going through the same things with apps or websites. The second point is obviously simplifying the GDPR and e-privacy compliance of the whole ecosystem, which we know includes a lot of publishers, but also a lot of vendors, a lot of advertisers, and we needed a simple way to share content between everyone. Without having to go through those one-on-one integrations, which are impractical and high cost. So that basically standardized solution allows sharing content with all vendors in a single way. So you only have to do it once, and then it works for all vendors without publishers having to implement anything specific to vendors. And if they add new vendors or remove vendors, everything should kind of like be updated automatically as well. So once the initial integration work is done, there shouldn't be much more to do. The third point that's common to both the mobile and the web version, and that I think is pretty important in the IAB framework, is that there's a centralized list of purposes and vendors that ensures that everyone's in the industry has a shared understanding of the GDPR, or shared base, put it this way, with common purposes. So there are about 5 of them today that are defined, and that go from basically analytics or ad personalization, and that help making sure that a publisher can collect the correct content that can then be used and understood by vendors. And the second part of those shared principles is the list of vendors. So you also have a centralized list of vendors that's hosted by the IAB. So you can basically find it on the website. So it would be this list. As you can see, there's a really good number of vendors that have committed to supporting the spec already, and I think they're adding more every week. And that was also important because obviously all the vendors that are part of the spec make sure that they respect it and that publishers can share content with them without having to do anything. So you know, the fact that there is those 2 centralized lists is really key to the whole framework. It also comes with a centralized list of CMPs that also plays the same role of who can we actually trust to implement this standard the correct way. That being said, we also have a fair amount of flexibility in the spec to accommodate for specific use cases, like for instance, allow vendors or publishers to collaborate on the right legal basis for a specific website or app. I know there are a lot of these questions around some publishers that want a specific legal basis, while some vendors might want another one for a specific purpose. So that's the type of like granular control we usually let or allow in the spec to make sure that everyone's happy with the final outcome. So there is, you know, a standard definition there, and then you can usually override some of the settings to make sure they fit your specific legal case. And then there is, so all those aspects are you know, not specific to the mobile spec at all, and to some extent that's important because it does mean that what we've done with the mobile spec is just making sure that we reuse the same base and the same platform as what we had for the web version, but then make sure that it works the right way in a mobile native environment. So the key question there was that sharing information between SDKs or between vendors in a given app is pretty hard from a technical perspective, where you don't necessarily want them to be calling each other or calling into a third-party SDK that would be the CMP, passing references around and things like that. So we needed to find a way to share that information in a more secure and stable way. So we decided not to go with like a direct port of the web implementation that would be kind of like exposing an API basically to all the SDKs in the app. And we used the shared storage as a communication mechanism between all the vendors, which proved to be more robust and stable than what we could have done with the web approach. So really the right way to think about the mobile spec is it reuses all the same basics as the web spec, but just make sure that it works nice in a mobile environment. That also means that you know, behind the app itself, so all the information that is sent to the vendor and that might be then forwarded to other vendors in like the RTP spec, for instance, is exactly the same. So we reuse the content string, we reuse the global vendor list, which includes the purposes and the vendors there. We reuse the CMP list, we reuse all of that and just make sure that we can use them the right way in the mobile app. From a more technical perspective, if we go through the mobile spec, so you're definitely welcome to take a look at it on the IAB GitHub. But it's really pretty simple. There are really 4 steps to it. The first one is, as a publisher or CMP, you want to be collecting user consent, so displaying the screen, making sure it has the right information coming from all the vendors you might be collecting consent for. That's pretty much the same setup as the web version as well. So you would usually go from your list of vendors or from all the vendors that are in the global list, in the list of purposes you need to be collecting, and then ask the user for consent, making sure that you allow the user to say no, either by purpose or by vendor. Then you want to be encoding that content information. Here again, we're using the exact same standard as the web version. So that's what's called the content string, which is basically encoding all the yes and no's from the user for the purposes and the vendors, along with some information on who did the content collection, so the CMP ID, when was the content collected, and some information like that, just to make sure we have all the relevant information to the content. Then that content string gets stored on the device in either what's called shared preferences on Android or NS defaults on iOS, which is a shared space for the app itself. And then any vendor can come and read into that shared space and interpret the values that are in there. So if you look at the spec, there is a pretty simple list of all the variables that should be written into the shared storage for the vendors to be able to read. And if you look at those, the main one is obviously the constant string here. So that's the exact constant string stored there. So any vendor can basically come and read the constant string from that shared space. So they don't really need to call into a CMP or publisher API or anything like that. They'll just be able to go and read from the shared preferences or NS defaults to find this exact key, and then read the value from there and get the current constant string for the user. We have a few other variables around there. Some of them are pretty standard, but also pretty useful, where we basically say if the user is subjected to GDPR or not. So if you are a non-EU publisher and the user is not in the EU, you usually do not apply GDPR to them. So that flag helps vendors decide if GDPR applies or not. And then a few others that are there for more technical purposes, but don't necessarily have different values or different content than what's in these two. So the general idea is the publisher or a CMP used by the publisher have to collect, encode, and store the content information on a device, and then any vendor can come and read that information pretty easily. Maybe the main aspect here that's not covered by the spec was how to share content across applications. So we don't really have a good technical solution at the device level at this point, and I would say that's more of a design thing that was chosen by like iOS or Android, where it's pretty hard to actually share information between your applications. So there is no good solution in the spec for this yet, while there is one for the web version. So I think we'll be looking into it. But the idea was also that that's something that can be implemented server-side by the publisher or the CMP directly. So that's not like it's absolutely not doable. That's just not part of the spec at the moment. So that's more or less how the mobile spec work. At the moment, it's pretty, I would say it's pretty simple from a workflow perspective, and then obviously there are some important details there, but the overall workflow is pretty straightforward, I think, to implement. And then what I thought was also pretty helpful was to discuss how you actually get started if you're a publisher specifically and you want to implement that spec and start collecting and sharing content with your vendors to get in compliance with GDPR and or e-privacy. What we've seen so far is that it's, the first step is really deciding if you want to build it in-house, so build towards that spec, or take and deploy a CMP. I'm obviously a little bit biased there because we're building and selling a CMP, but we've seen publishers doing both options pretty successfully. So I do think publishers are able to build themselves when they want to. It does involve registering as a CMP with the IAB and then implementing to the spec. So it's not super straightforward, but it's not that complicated either. So if you're interested in building it yourself, I don't think it's a crazy thought there. You do have a fair amount of choices in terms of CMP out there. And I have a few ideas about why you should pick a CMP versus build any of that. For instance, they would follow the IAB standard. They have a commitment to obviously follow it and keep it up to date with when they register as CMP. We're also usually pretty flexible in terms of what we offer for UI options. So we'll have like standard options, or we'll have APIs to let you build your own UI when you want to, and just let us deal with the IAB spec and with sharing content and storing content and all of that in the background. So I think as a publisher, it's especially important in your app, obviously even more so than in a website, to make sure that the content workflow, the content UI is pretty integrated with the rest of your app. So that's something you can definitely focus on in both types of cases. One thing you might not want to forget if you're building your own, or if you're hesitating between picking one or building it, is that content. What we've seen happen for the web already in the last 2 months is that content is becoming a critical part of your revenue. where it basically impacts your revenue because you might be serving more or less personalized ads if you're collecting content or not. And that means you want to be able to have analytics, optimization, A/B testing, kind of like all the things you might have with ads, and make sure you can apply the same things to content. And the right way to think about it, from what we've seen, is that there is a direct relationship between your content rate and your dollar revenue. So you want to spend a fair amount of time on that. And the last part is pretty important as a CMP is the legal storage of content for future proof. So you want to be able to keep track of all the content you've collected, what the exact content information you provided to the user was at the time, and keep that like in a centralized place that you can both reuse if you ever had to prove that you actually collected content, or if you need content in a different setup than the app itself, you might also want to be able to access that. So those are the main questions I say that drive your ability to deploy your own CMP or buy one. And I think, no matter what your strategy says, you want to be thinking about these questions in terms of how does that eventually impact my ad revenue, and how do I make sure that it doesn't impact it too much or not at all. The second step, once you have a CMP in place and a content workflow in place, is to basically update your vendors SDK. So all the vendors in the list should theoretically be compliant with the spec already. What we've seen with the web is that there was initially some work around making sure everything was flowing correctly. I would say those are mostly sorted out at this point, so it should be pretty good. And you'll usually have to go through an update of your SDKs basically, so that you can benefit from the newer versions that actually include the IAB framework compliance. And then that's pretty much it. So it's usually, not necessarily very, very technical to get there. And I would say that's a big win from the spec and from the framework as a whole, which is that it has standardized a lot of what we actually need to do, and that it does help in making sure that all your vendors are in compliance, that you are in compliance as well if you're a publisher. All right, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today. I hope that was useful, and I think Chris mentioned we could spend some time on taking any question if there is any from people on the call.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jawad. So for those of you who are new to this, we have on GoToWebinar a questions and answers pane, and on the right-hand side of your screen, you can enter your questions, and I'll read them out to Jawad and see if we can answer them. I see that there is one question already, which is very long, so bear with me, Jawad. I'll try and summarize it if I can. It's a question from Zach Edwards, and he asks, if a mobile app publisher wanted to append some of the data segment standards that are being developed by the IAB in their application, and they wanted to segment which data segments were appended to which users, is there a standardized way to append that data to users based on page, action, or event rules? And he explains he's trying to figure out if there's a tag management solution for dynamically segmenting your audience under the IAB data segment standards within an application or web page. Is that something you'd be able to answer, or should I copy paste the question so you can read it yourself?
I mean, that'd be helpful if you can send that over to me. My initial thought on that was I'm not the best expert on the separate spec that's on the data segments. I'm not sure that I can really talk to that. One point on the web version though is what we usually tend to do is have integrations with tag managers and have easy ways to do conditional loading of tags based on content information. So I would say, as outside of the scope of the separate IAB data segment spec, I would say that there are a good amount of ways of saying, only do this when there's content or when there's no content, or when there's content for that and that. The mobile version is usually slightly different, where as a CMP, we would have a little less control over what you're doing as a publisher, and we would let you do more. So we usually offer all the APIs you might need to get that information of what's the exact content status of the user or events and things like that. But we usually offer kind of like lower level control and let you decide what to do and when.
Okay, thanks for taking a stab at it anyway. To Zach, who asked the question, I would say maybe send us an email at IAB Europe, and we can see if we can forward you to someone who who might be able to answer more specifically, but I see that he's just said, awesome, thank you. So I guess you answered his question to some extent. There's another question here from David Dabbs. Hi, David. He asks, do you have a sense for how many ad SDK providers have released updated SDKs compatible with the mobile spec?
I would say I don't. And does I don't know if Chris, you have an opinion on that from an IAB perspective. I would say even in the tech lab, we could ask Jennifer as well and try to get an answer to that.
Yeah, it's something that we don't have a very good oversight of, to be fair, because we operate more or less technologically neutral, as in a vendor doesn't have to proclaim that they are mobile or web-based. So we don't really have a clear figure on that, but maybe somebody at Tech Lab might know a bit better or be able to give more kind of information around that. Okay, I'll give it another minute for questions to roll in. For those of you who are interested, and this might be spoilers, I've just heard that it's 2-0 in the quarterfinal between France and Uruguay. So, yay for anyone supporting France.
I like that.
Yeah, I thought you might like that. So since there's a bit of since we wait a bit to see if there's any more questions, it's a very simple slide deck, but would you be okay with sharing this to all the attendees and the people who registered?
Sure, I can send you that right after.
Okay. So for those of you who are new to these webinars, I always send a follow-up email. Usually it's exactly the week after. Sometimes there's a delay, but you will then get the slides as well as a link to the recording on GoToWebinar, so you can watch this back. A question has come in which asks, is this mobile aspect considered IAB 2.0? What I think you're alluding to is whether this is the 2.0 version of the IAB technical specification. That's not the case. I would say it's essentially an adaptation of our technical specification for mobile. And as Jalad is showing on the screen, this is v1.0, is that correct? Or are we on 1.1?
I think it's 1.0, and as you said, it's an addition or an extension to the CMP.js API, which is a web version of the spec. And then they're both relying on that constant string and vendor list format spec, which is kind of like the base for both of them. And you can think of also as the URL-based content passing as like a third option for sharing content in the different environments. I would say the JS API, the mobile, the URL-based are environment-specific specifications based on the same base, which is constant string and GVL, basically.
Yeah, and as you can see on the screen, and as is being pointed out, the current consent string specification, so the underlying technical specification for the whole framework, is at version 1.1.
Right.
And yeah, that's essentially the point we're at. Question came in from Stefan Hanloser, who asks, does the mobile spec support pubvendors.json?
That's a good question. It should, and to some extent, it's on the CMPs to do so, where it's not necessarily, it's not part of the spec per se, where there's nothing specific to pub vendors in the spec, but it's part of the it's part of the overall framework. So eventually, when it's finally released, CMPs should support pub vendors for mobile in-app. There is one question still open, which is about where does pub vendors leave for applications. I don't think that's finalized either. The idea was to try and follow what's being done for ads.txt, which is also being updated to have a mobile in-app version that is likely to leave close to the App Store, or have a way to find the pub vendors JSON or the app.txt from the App Store itself. So if I remember correctly, using the domain name that's registered for the app in the store, something like that. So the idea is to follow that and make sure we use the same structure so that it's easy for everyone to follow. So in short, yes, as soon as pub vendor is out, that should start being implemented by CMPs as well.
All right, thanks a lot. And on pub vendors, though, Jason, I just wanted to say, after the consultation phase, there seems to be a lot of work that needs to be done around pub vendors, as well as the overall policies of the framework. So it is being worked on, obviously. I'll just say that there will be more news hopefully soon. And if all goes well, in 2 weeks' time from now, exactly, we will hope to hold a webinar on the updated pub vendors that Jason thought. Question from Zach Edwards. Can we talk about quality score or effectiveness of consent pop-ups with pop-up blockers or other display problems from mobile consent? Is there an industry standard click-based consent conversion rate per user? I don't think that such a thing exists. It depends on CMPs, and different CMPs report different figures. But on the whole, we're getting, I think, what we've heard directly in terms of feedback is very high click-through rates normally. Maybe, I don't know if you have anything you could say specifically for Didomi, Jawad?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do agree that it's going to be very specific to not necessarily CMP, but to the publisher implementation, both in terms of UI, audience, and kind of, let's call it, policy choices. There is still a big debate around what is positive action or positive content. So the idea there is clicking a website. Is clicking on a website a positive action? If yes, then your content rate is going to be anywhere above 90%, because technically, so many more users are going to actually consent versus if you're saying I want an explicit click on my banner, then you're going to have a lower consent rate. It's hard to say exactly where. I would say we're seeing anywhere between 60 to 80%, depending on the audience you might have, the exact UI, the exact colors and stuff like that, and the integration you might have. So if you're using a big pop-up on the screen, you're going to get a 80-90+% consent rate. If you're using a small banner somewhere on the side, you're going to get a 50-60% consent rate. So I would say, there is definitely variation between CMPs, but more importantly, there's a lot of variation in how you decide to implement it.
All right, thanks for that. In the meantime, David Dabbs has given us some additional information around pub vendors. He says the pub vendors working group will be addressing mobile next, he believes, and ads.txt is currently tackling apps. So it might be that we follow their lead. Right. And also on, what an affirmative act is. Of course, that's the big thing that everyone is saying, is that we essentially need definitive court judgment, essentially.
Yeah, and I would say don't hold your breath for that.
Yeah, exactly. That will take a long time. There was recently a case around, not the GDPR, but around the Data Protection Directive that I've been looking at, about whether or not you're a controller by being an administrator of a fan page. And looking back through the legal history of that court case started in 2011 in Germany. It only got to the European Court of Justice in 2016, and it's only been judged now in 2018. So that gives you an idea of how slow it can be for a definitive judgment in the European Court. But in the meantime, there will be a lot more going on in terms of practical actions.
And I think what's important to mention there is that as Didomi, we're part of usually both what's called the tech lab, which is responsible for the tech specs, and then separately we have policy groups that are usually more as part of the IAB RUP. And so we work on both questions. The tech specs usually try to be cognizant of the fact that there are going to be different interpretations today between different companies, publishers, CMPs, and whatever, but also that's going to change over time with regulation or jurisprudence. So what we do there usually is try to be flexible. So there's no choice made from a tech perspective, and we try to be supportive of all options. we try to be transparent about them. So if you decide to go with one legal basis as a vendor, you need to be transparent about it. And then publishers can make the choice of accepting that or not, for instance. So we don't try to solve those through tech solutions. We try to accept the fact that sometimes it's not completely clear, and we just make sure the tools support that uncertainty until it resolves itself, if it ever does.
All right. Yeah. Great. I think since I haven't seen any more new questions pop up, we can probably call it a day with that, and then give everyone half an hour back of their working day. So thank you again for joining us, Jawad, and thanks everyone for dialing in.
Sure, thank you.
As I said, I'll be sending an email round next week, hopefully on Monday, with the slides and a recording. And as always, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, if anything was unclear. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, bye.